Hear that. All right. Well, I'm really excited to introduce our two speakers, Lauren and Sadie, who are going to talk about building equity into community engagement practices through the process of community co-design. Lauren has spent the past 6 years working in the field of sustainability with experience in urban forestry, stormwater, and food systems. She's currently the sustainability coordinator with the City of Rochester and works to create a culture of sustainability through environmental, economic, and social equity components while collaborating to build capacity between city departments and community partners. Sadie is a polymath with a penchant for learning and working at the intersection of government, communities, and science. Drawing from her experience in local government, nonprofits, small business, research and education, she builds bridges across disciplines, sharing resources, connections, and opportunities, and empowering individuals to discover and develop their skills. An advocate for inclusivity, Sadie's work focuses on nature-based solutions, environmental justice, and community engagement. Currently, she's a stormwater associate at the City of Rochester and continues her Minnesota Green Corps work, advocating for equitable public participation in city projects. So I am going to go ahead and turn things over to Lauren and Sadie. You should have the ability to share if you need to share screens, and hope we'll have time for questions and discussion afterwards.
Thank you. Excited to be here. Thanks for having us. It's nice to see some familiar faces as well from when I was a Green Corps member doing stormwater work myself a few years ago. So today we're here to talk about co-design, which is a type of community engagement process that we've been using here in Rochester and with some partners created a toolkit for that we're happy to follow up and share with some of the resources after today's meeting. But more importantly, how we recently used this co-design process with a grant that we had received to support our comprehensive surface water management plan that we're working on here in Rochester, and how resilience hubs tie into that. So I'll start with a little bit of introduction to co-design, why we've chosen to use this process within the city, what the process itself kind of looks like. I'll do a little intro on our sustainability and resiliency plan, which is where this resilience hub concept and strategy lies. And then I'll hand it over to Sadie to dive a little bit deeper into the connection between that and our comprehensive surface water management plan, and then the actual co-design process for resilience hubs here in Rochester. So really with co-design, it is a different form of community engagement that really challenges the balance of power within groups. So especially in local government, who we often hear from is not it tends to be the same people. We see the same voices showing up, those that feel comfortable to show up in a local government setting and use their voice and advocate for certain things. And we're really missing out on the voices of the people that are actually most impacted by climate change and the effects of it, and typically are less well off in terms to react or adapt to those effects of climate change. So what co-design is doing is really seeking to change that by really focusing on building relationships within the community, and building capacity. The more people that are involved in these processes, the more people that feel comfortable engaging at this level within the community, and that starts to spread throughout the groups that we're working with. What it does here is, typically when in the past, we've used redlining, and as an example, we have this graph on the right-hand side of the screen that shows a lot of different key measures in Minnesota and the racial gaps between those. But what we're doing with this engagement process is prioritizing the involvement of community members who, as I mentioned, are most heavily impacted by the effects of climate change and historically have been excluded from decision-making processes, especially in local government. It's important because a lot of times crises, planning, projects, policies, whatever it is that we're putting together for our community, typically can have disproportionate impacts and has. So, redlining is an example of that, the policies that were created and the disproportionate impacts that that had on certain communities. Housing that goes along with that in terms of who was able to purchase a house and where, and how that all plays into one another, and the generational effects that that has on certain groups within our community. So really looking to engage those groups within this engagement process. Really where we start is kind of the stakeholder power mapping. And so again, we're looking at who's highly impacted by these decisions that we're making for our community, but typically has low access to involvement or collaboration within them. We usually kind of partner those with this upper right-hand quadrant as well. So who is also highly impacted but has high access. So bringing those groups together with those of us in local government, with our other, business or nonprofit leaders in town who maybe develop the programs and services that also serve these groups and other community members, and bringing them together to really think about, who has the most influence in the process implementation to get it done and see it through, but who is it impacting, and how are we making sure that it aligns with what their needs are and what their vision is for this community as well. The other thing that co-design really does is it's really seeking to reduce barriers to participation. Again, referencing local government, it's you show up at an open house or you come to a city council meeting and you share your open comments or your feedback at that place. It's, typically always in the same place, usually after working hours or maybe even during working hours. It doesn't necessarily invite different people to come in and speak just because of those barriers that are already in place. So what we're doing with co-design is reducing a lot of those barriers. Folks who participate in co-design are compensated for their time throughout this process. We hold the meetings in areas that they are already familiar with, or with other community groups and buildings that they might already be accessing for other services or just feel comfortable with as a community in the group they represent. We work on the meeting times, and we provide stipends for transportation and childcare costs to reduce those barriers as well. Really ensuring that we are getting a range of voices that are able to participate in this process by removing as many of those barriers as possible. Once we have co-designers identified, there's always a connection to figure out what day of the week and what time works best. All of the meetings are really set and scheduled around their availability and what works for them. And so as a project team, they really do become and are a part of the project team when we're using co-design for a particular project or program that we're working through. We also bring in facilitators. Again, there is distrust in government. That's just the way it is. And so, we're in Rochester working on training local facilitators to do the co-design process so that, one, we're building capacity and skill sets for community members to continue this and kind of take this on and be compensated for their time to lead this process in the community. But two, those groups are comfortable with the relationships and the people they know. And so they're much more likely to be honest and open with someone from their own community or peer network than just me and someone else from local government. So really bringing in those different lived experiences in terms of how the process is even facilitated and who and how they're connecting with throughout it. Essentially, what this is doing is, I'm sure people are familiar with the spectrum of public participation. If not, this graph kind of shows it. A lot of the times we really sit in the inform and consult area. We finish a plan, we bring it to the public, let us know your feedback. Maybe we use that, maybe we don't, but we kind of already have a finished plan or program that we're bringing forward. And what this really does is it brings those in to be a part of the participation from the beginning of the project. So participants help drive the agenda, they help drive the discussion. It really opens up that opportunity for innovation and things that we would miss early on in even developing a project or a program before we get too far into it. And it might be too late to change or switch things or just harder. So what we're doing is really bringing them in to collaborate. They're a part of the project team. They're a part of the decision making throughout that process. Really keeping a continuous feedback loop with how this information is being used, what the next steps are, what it's proposed, if it's not being used, why or why not. And really kind of reaching and trying to go towards that empower where the final decision making is in the hands of the public. I don't know that we're quite there yet, but with co-design, it really is getting close to that in terms of, these projects and these policies or programs that we're putting together with the co-design process. The final product is something that was developed with those community members. Ultimately, it goes to City Council to be voted on or approved. If it's through our local jurisdiction, it's different for community partners who might be using the process, but it really does say a lot when we go to council and we have something that's a vetted plan or program, and we can say this many people participated in it from this many different organizations and groups or backgrounds within the community. And I will say that especially for our sustainability and resiliency plan, that's something our council president always points back to when we bring things forward and new strategies that we're trying to implement, is really honing in on the fact that these plans or programs were developed by community members, and that's who they're sitting up there to represent. So this again just kind of goes over some of the differences between traditional engagement and co-design. Community is typically responding to predetermined options, whereas co-design is they're there to identify the problem, work through those maybe key themes or issues, keep reiterating that throughout the process, and ultimately develop the end result and help implement it after the fact if there's interest and desire to do that as well. Typically we're asking community members to volunteer their time and perspective. Co-designers are being professionally compensated, and we're really valuing that lived experience. A degree is very different than someone's lived experience in a community. So there's different types of experience that we want to bring to the table to be included in these discussions. And we really are prioritizing that lived experience over the learned experience. A lot of times the project team from the city or whatever organization is bringing that learned experience, but I don't have the same lived experience in our community as the voices that we're really trying to bring in and capture in this process. All phases of this design is decision making within the community and the people that are participating. And really, it's investing in those long-term relationships and that trust building. It's focusing on the engagement and the depth, so more of the quality of the engagement, less quantity in terms of those that are involved. And especially in local government, we also like to, look at quantity and point to, we interacted with 500 people, but were 90% of those people white citizens of a certain age, so the quantity of the relationships and the interactions that we're building throughout this process, the quality of those more than the quantity. Again, traditional engagement is typically individuals. We're getting individual responses. We're getting, surveys. It's all coming from individual people to us sharing their information. And what co-design really is based off of is those networks that community members have with one another. So as a co-designer, their task between kind of our project meetings is to go out and interact and engage with their peers, their community groups, whoever it is that they kind of interact with throughout their lived experience as a community member, and ask them questions and interview them and bring that back to our project meeting for the next iteration of the discussion and follow up there. So it's using those existing networks that community members have to bring information back and synthesize that as a group together. And it's people that, again, someone like me wouldn't maybe have the same response or opportunity to connect with throughout the community that co-designer does with their own community when they're out there interacting. This just kind of shows an example of what this all looks like put together, but we're bringing in that community experience and perspective to be a part of this process. It's a little bit of a loop where we have these discussions, we kind of come up with some promising solutions or final programs. We bring that back to the co-designers to kind of have a checkpoint of like, is this what we discussed? Is this what you thought you would see as the final outcome? Yes or no? Kind of make those changes, and then they actually bring that back to their communities for a final vetting before we launch a final prototype or come forward with anything as a final plan within the community. This shows the sequence of co-design meetings. So we have design studios is what we call them. That's where the project team and the co-designers all meet together for a couple of hours. The first design studio really is kind of an introduction to co-design, getting to know one another, and then we give them an opportunity to kind of practice that interviewing technique that they'll be tasked to do over the next couple of weeks before the next time we all meet again. So we provide an initial discussion guide and questions for them based on the topic or the problem at hand that we're trying to address. And then they have the next 2 to 3 weeks to spend time interviewing and connecting with community members, other people that they interact with on a day-to-day basis, to get additional information about these key themes that we're trying to hone in on, to either identify barriers and solutions to. They come back to a next design studio, they share out everything they heard from those community members, and we kind of work through it together with the facilitators and this project team to kind of pull out, okay, we're hearing about this, what's the next level that we could take that to, or what does this mean, and what's the questions that we can ask to dig deeper on that particular topic or that pain point. We'll come up with new questions, and this process is reiterated 2 to 3 times before we have these final solutions that we bring forward to share. This is all outlined in the co-design toolkit that we'll follow up and share, but it really walks through what co-design is, the process of it, how to identify these stakeholders, how to set it up, and really as well as like, does it work for the project at hand? Co-design doesn't work for everything, nor should it. It is another tool within the toolbox of community engagement tools that can be used. Some things are better meant as like an open house or town hall type style of things. If you know that the scope of the project or the decision is going to be limited, it doesn't really allow for that full co-design process. And so this really is, working with liaisons and looking at the project at hand to determine if co-design is really a good fit for it or not. This is just a quick little example of the different projects we've used in Rochester and utilized co-design for. Our very first one was Discovery Walk, which is a public realm project. It's basically a public parkway that will connect Soldiers Field, which is 4 blocks outside of downtown, to our downtown core. And we brought in co-designers of different backgrounds. We had some representing those in our community with disabilities. We had a high school student. We had someone that practices health. A bunch of different backgrounds to kind of design what should this public park look like, and what maybe have our other public parks been lacking that don't invite you to use them or spend time in them as a community member. We've used it for our Global Mayors Challenge a couple years ago with BIPOC women's participation in our built environment. We have a lot of development and construction happening here in Rochester because of the Destination Medical Center and that whole initiative. And we know that women, and especially women of color, were most impacted by COVID. And so how do we, connect that to these really great, well-paying careers that we have in our community? And so we brought together women of color and people from the built environment, and we had this co-design process where we came up with a program, and that won us $1 million in this challenge that we're now implementing. So it goes a long way, especially for projects when you can really show the community's involvement, and that it really is developed by the community. It is, I think, not only for if you are applying for grants or things like that, but for the community itself and their kind of ownership over it and the want to be a part of that project moving forward. We've done it for bus station designs with our new rapid transit project that's coming in. We've done it for home ownership in Rochester, and we'll go into a little more detail on our resilience hubs here as an example. So really quickly for background, before we jump into resilience hubs, is we had put together a sustainability and resiliency community work plan. This was an iteration of co-design where we brought together different community members. We did that stakeholder power mapping analysis. We kind of picked out the different groups and voices that we really wanted to be a part of this process. And we had 45 community members that participated over the course of a year on a monthly basis to help us develop our sustainability plan for the Rochester community. We then use those task force members to further connect with other community groups in what we called listening sessions. So we hosted 30 or 32 listening sessions that connected us with 150 or so community members. And for those listening sessions, that is where we offered compensation for those participants, kind of held them in places that they were already convening or maybe going to, and really, again, used all of that lived experience to develop our sustainability plan. It's 6 different focus areas. These were kind of a high level of the needs that were identified by task force members and community members. But essentially, one of our strategies within this sustainability plan was resilience hubs. That was something that came up and was shared, and our task force members agreed with it. And so, working to create a network of these resource hubs that increase residents' access and education to respond to community needs. Again, it really ties into our emergency services, but not everyone is equipped to react and respond to climate change in the same way. And so how can we leverage this concept of resilience hubs in our communities to assist community members with that, but also a lot of other programming efforts as well. Really, Sadie will kind of go into a little bit more of what resilience hubs are, but they're really there to almost be community centers of sorts on a neighborhood level. And with that, I will pass it over to Sadie here to go through our comprehensive surface water management plan and the resilience hubs co-design process.
So much. So for this part, this is where I got to work with Stephanie. I had the incredible privilege of being a core team member on this project and being able to see, you know, every single different planning team as well as form the engagement along with Stephanie. And so our last comprehensive surface water management plan was made in the 90s and it hadn't been updated since then. It was a really, you know, especially for the time, comprehensive plan even back then. And it did use a lengthy advisory group, but those were kind of, you know, who you would expect to be on that kind of advisory group. And I cannot stress enough how fortunate we were to have Stephanie as the leader on the engagement for this project. She just took it to a whole new level. So obviously, as I'm sure this group knows, surface water management plan will, you know, document focus areas, goals, actions. It'll describe all of your surface waters and connections and groundwaters, define their goals and policies for going forward for the next 20-ish years, and then identify whatever buzzword you want to use for your goals, actions, tactics, strategies, just the stuff you do to be able to achieve those goals and that higher vision. Next slide. For our plan this time around, we started out with a couple of different engagement strategies. There was the, you know, the tried and true traditional survey, but they made sure to bring out 3 different surveys. There was one for city teammates that were outside of our core planning team, so they were the other departments that don't usually interact with stormwater. There was also a developer survey because we know that developers are very much impacted by our policies, especially with stormwater. They also have a very strong and loud voice in town. And then we also had the community survey. We had, I think in total between all of those, more than 200 responses through it. The City of Rochester uses Polko for their community surveying. They have a list you can sign up for. So every time a new survey comes out, it, auto sends to the people who sign up to get those. Now, the great thing about that is we got a bunch of responses from people, and the way that we set up the survey had a mix of different, choose on this Likert scale or check this box and rank priorities and things. So we kind of had those like already analyzed, ready to go as soon as they all spit out. But we also had a number of questions in there that were just an open text kind of response and like, tell us about your values, tell us about your experiences. And again, that's really driven by Stephanie. Thank you so much. I'm so sorry. And my cat doesn't like the fact that I'm talking, so you may see her. But one of the really, really, really important things that came of all of these surveys, and especially the community survey, was being able to see that it reached a very narrow demographic. That's a very specific kind of person in town. They are the ones who are normally more active. They are paying attention. They're involved with all of these things. So they are the ones showing up and participating. And we, obviously for a comprehensive citywide plan, want to make sure that those are not the only voices that we hear. There are other lived experiences that we needed to know about. So we had the opportunity to kind of do a co-design inspired advisory group work. We did pay our designers. We did go through the process of reaching out to kind of non-traditional groups and paths to be able to bring them in. And through all of that, we came out to have these main drivers. And I just want to point out some of these because I'll bring them back later. Obviously, quality of life and social equity, resilience, and our environmental stewardship, recreation, being able to use our waters, access to waters, the infrastructure, and then fiscal responsibility and sustainability really came back as like, don't forget, this is super important. So next slide. So this grant, I really look up to Gina McCarthy. She has a saying that I think about a lot, that if you know the answer will be no to something, don't push for it. Instead, find another in. And so find another avenue, find another person or another way that's going to, again, just kind of like validate or reiterate the need for whatever it is that you're going toward. And this opportunity arose, and Stephanie is phenomenal at seeing and addressing grants opportunities. And so she saw this new one from Minnesota Pollution Control Agency that had to do with a mix of stormwater, wastewater, resilience. And they were kind of like, we know this is all important together, but we haven't offered a grant like this before. Try. And so Stephanie jumped immediately, and she's like, hey, we know from multiple different avenues that resilience hubs are a big deal, and they are a way that they're especially a subject area that we want to make sure that the voices that are heard from that are the kind where we're using a method that is more qualitative and not quantitative, because of their function and who they are meant to support in town. And so, and also another in an avenue was the more traditional kind of ask for this funding, in that our engineering consultants really wanted to be able to do some super duper heavy duty data intensive modeling for flooding in the watershed. And so we took that opportunity to pair those things together and say, we're going to pair together both our traditional science engineering modeling alongside this qualitative and lived experiences to learn more about how we can best help our communities with our extremely volatile, uncertain future that's coming up with this climate change and hazardous weather events. So this was kind of our starting place, our in for the grant. And next slide. And then it was really backed up by all these different plans that all came together, and they all said, hey, we need this. So we had the great fortune of having Lauren already completed this massive plan, and she did an incredible amount of engagement, and it was put together very beautifully by that point as well. So we could bring that plan up and say, hey, this was already identified as something that's needed in, you know, the community, and we want to explore this further. And next slide. And then as well from us, you know, if we're going to cite one, we need that engineering side, but also we need to be a little more critical and use those lived experience insights. So we have those two, both the resilience plan as well as our surface water management plan that are calling for this need for resilience hubs. And then next one. And also happened to be the timing that our county and city are both reevaluating and going back through their emergency management plans and their all hazard assessments. And so that one is kind of on the side right now with us, but it's very much still informing what we're doing, and we are informing kind of the things that they are asking. And so we had these 3 areas that were all saying, we need this, and this is a unique grant opportunity, and PCA is open to this. So it was a beautiful little magical bundle of opportunity. And next slide. So this is our amended timeline of all of this. Lauren started her work way back in April of 2020. I came on board in the fall of 21, and it was very shortly after that Stephanie saw this grant available, and she just like already has a ton of stuff written up for when an opportunity arises, like, let's go. So we super quickly got that application in, and we were awarded funding. And you'll notice on here that we're awarded in July of 2022, and we did not begin until January of 2023. We can get deeper into that if people have questions later, but again, that just gets back to a lot of that trust building, relationship building. All of that is so incredibly important, and engagement fatigue is real, especially from, you know, groups that people love to reach out to get at their DEI goals. Then you'll also notice on this timeline, Lauren had talked about kind of that process of the design studios and those sprints in between. We learned in there that our co-designers really needed more than just those 2 weeks in between our meeting times. They ended up needing about 3 weeks in between so that they could have multiple more of those in-depth conversations. And they always came back with such incredible insights, and they appreciated having the extra time. So if you don't know what resilience hubs are, just a tidbit about them. They are both a physical establishment that is meant to provide services for communities before, during, and after emergency situations or disasters. They are meant to be functional both during blue skies as well as gray skies if you're in emergency management land. And they try to find this nexus, you know, between some of those similar areas that we all talk about in our plans. We want to focus on, you know, our social, our financial, our environmental, make sure that everything comes together and we're seeing things as a whole. And there are a couple of different guides out there that try and help you assess your own community's needs in getting to this. But generally, hubs are meant to support residents, they coordinate communication, they distribute resources. They are themselves meant to be sustainable and clean functioning facilities, as well as have, you know, resilient infrastructure. So those alternative energy sources, things that are going to be able to hold up during a lot of our emergency or extreme weather events, and help communities thrive. So some of the things that you might see in resilience hubs are those green roofs, solar panels, the emergency food and water supplies, those gathering spaces, and green space, things like that, kind of the traditionals that you might think of. And the 5 core areas that they point out that you want to be able to dig into and address are the services and programs, communications, buildings and landings, power, and operations. So our initial thoughts when we, as the staff members, the experts, the professionals kind of set out, we thought initially like our main takeaway areas are going to be within this climate change, hazardous weather events. It's going to be about emergency preparedness and how prepared are we? How can we be more prepared? And then what community services are going to be needed within this building. And this was a perfect example of why you should start with co-design and community engagement when you're doing, new and unique planning, rather than bringing them in later. So start with that, collaborate and empower that Lauren showed earlier, as a means of, even fiscal responsibility, rather than course correcting later and maybe not even doing it that well. Start from them. Start from those lived experiences, not the learned. So really some of the biggest things that we took away from our co-designers were, yes, they do want physical places to shelter, especially during events. A lot of people either don't have AC, so those extreme heat times, especially in, neighborhoods where there's a lot of concrete, not a whole lot of shade, that's super important to have those spaces available. Also, power outages, and in the winter, we had co-designers talk about instances where they didn't have heat. And we're fairly concerned, especially with having a 2-month-old at the time, weren't sure when it would come back on. So yes, that physical place to shelter, very important. But really what they pushed over and over and over again was in that education and outreach and the communications and community navigators. That was something that they came up with that we saw and we held on to, and also really try to elevate in terms of next planning opportunities. So that education and outreach, they want to be aware themselves. They want to know about hazards. They want to know about emergency preparedness. They themselves want to be prepared. They themselves want to be able to self-organize within their own communities. They want to have those communication channels already existing. They want to have their community navigators because they don't want to rely on anybody else in a time of crisis. They want to be prepared. They want to be self-sufficient. They want agency in what happens during an emergency. And I think like anybody can agree that you want that. And so, those were just things that we really took away within it. So these key components within those services and programs, the things that they really wanted to talk about, again, that emergency preparedness, not only education, but host workshops, physically help people make those kits and be prepared. We know from behavior change programming that you have to reduce barriers. Well, one of those barriers is in literally putting your kit together. I mean, somewhat embarrassing. Like I myself at home, don't even fully have my go bag ready and prepared, which is, thanks to Dr. Heidi Roop, known to be a climate action that you can take to reduce emissions and need and strain on systems, especially during a crisis. The community classes, new resident engagement, that was a really, really, really important one that I don't think we ever would have thought about on our own as the staff professionals and experts in this space. Again, communications, and they really pushed that collaboration and the trust between all of them together. Being trained, having culturally relevant and communications in multiple languages that are accurate. Had a really great story from one of our co-designers about how the school system has a wonderful alert system, and you can choose a number of different languages that are relevant within the community. However, they learned kind of the hard way that auto-translate doesn't pick up often on the fact that some languages don't have words for the things we experience here, like hail. And so hail came across as just snow, which when you read that, your perception of that risk is very different than the perception of a risk that you would see if you saw hail. So Also, something really important in the community, there are a number of people who don't have access to kind of the traditional like rec center, gym spaces. That is changing a lot in town. Some people really brought up again and again the impact that the closing of the local YMCA had. And while there is another rec center available, a lot expressed that it's either too far away to get to, which it is further on the outskirts of town, or it's too expensive for them and they just can't afford it, especially for their whole family to be able to access it. Wi-Fi, of course, community working spaces, and then super important that they stressed again and again is bathrooms and water fountains. Those are things that we just don't have everywhere in town. And I think that's true in a lot of cities as well, especially after COVID. Those bathrooms got shut down and they didn't open up again for a number of different reasons. And we don't address that here, but pointing that out. Next slide. So after we had a number of those meeting and go talk and meeting and go talk and meeting and go talk, towards the end, we also brought out a bunch of different maps and also pulled in that flood map that the consultants made for us and looked at these intersections like, okay, so now we know some different from our original proposal with PCA that we were going to have an exact location. We learned that's not actually what's needed. More so it's looking at these systems and having a guide for how to do this in each kind of neighborhood and area of need. And so we put together some of these maps and talked with our co-designers about, you know, what's an existing place that you want it to be. And they really said it should be an already trusted institution. And we really don't want it to be a government center. So schools for them. They said schools were the best place, and what they really wanted were for, you know, their emergency spaces to be schools or a place that they already knew how to get to, their kids already knew how to get to. Schools themselves, that ended up being kind of tough. Looking at the flood map, they're not super accessible, and some of them have flooding issues. And then if you go to the next slide, Lauren. However, we do have a unique kind of building and spot and place in town, Cascade Meadow, and it is next to a school. This is a building that was built originally with the intent of being kind of like a leader, a space at the forefront of, I don't know if resiliency was a word at that point, or at least a buzzword, but having renewable energy, you know, having examples of best practices for protecting our water resources and for flooding emergencies. And so it's a beautiful space to go to. Currently, it functions as classrooms for nursing students mostly at St. Mary's, but also a great spot that we went out for hiking. It has great wetlands and things like that. But by looking at this map, we were able to see, okay, if we're trying to find a place where the basement is not likely to flood and all emergency routes are likely to be open, where can we be? And Cascade Meadow came out as one of those. And I took a couple of pictures one day because I stood in the parking lot and also noticed not only is there a school right next to Cascade Meadow, there's also a radio station and there's also the rec center available. However, the road to get to the rec center does flood. Actually, and like in everyday experience, apparently, in big rains. So things to think about. And of course, like if that's the only thing, that's a fairly easy fix. Maybe we can put that at the top of a priority list for future road improvements. So those findings, again, trust, cultural relevance, being represented, feeling like you belong in a space is going to be key. If any of you, you know, really dug into the after stories that came out of Katrina, some of those issues in the lack of care and support afterwards was that lack of belonging and trust in the places that they were maybe told to go. Anyways, relationships, the networking, community engagement, and being able to collaborate and build their own networks.
I think this is where I'll take it over and wrap us up here. So I just wanted to reiterate a little bit too of what Sadie was talking about in those last couple of slides is when we had first put together this grant application, it was combining that modeling that needed to be done for the comprehensive surface water management plan and the siting of resilience hubs. And when we started the co-design process, that's something that kind of goes back to the beginning of what fits and makes sense for using co-design. And so that was a little bit kind of changed as we embarked on the process in understanding that actual siting and locations of resilience hubs isn't really something co-design it would be a good process for. We know where we should or shouldn't site resilience hubs based on this modeling, the flooding, where there are existing services and amenities within the community. Obviously, we can't cite a resilience hub in a place, maybe co-designers love this location and spot, but if it's flooding or roads flood to access it in a time of emergency, that's not a good site for a resilience hub. So we really, because of that modeling and all those maps, knew where areas or sites would make sense. And so what the co-design process really honed in on was, what do we want to see in a resilience hub? What are the parameters that the community, like, are almost the check boxes that we would do if we were developing a resilience hub that we know the community would want to see? And so that's really what they helped with, where what are the services, the programming, what is the design of the resilience hub? What are the types of amenities that you would be able to access at that resilience hub? Not necessarily the location. And that made a lot more sense for the co-design process. And so really just to wrap this all up, to kind of bring back together why co-design for these types of processes and really what's gained throughout this process. It's a deeper level of engagement with communities. I mentioned this earlier on, but what someone is hearing from their own community member or friend or peer is very different than what someone would share with me as a representative local government. That's just not information that I'm going to obtain or that all people would feel comfortable sharing with me at that type of level. And so that's why these co-designers are so important, is because they are representatives that are trusted by their communities, to really have those deep and meaningful conversations and to be trusted to bring that back into a shared space. It builds competency throughout our community, culturally, diversity, inclusion. It builds that out throughout the whole community. It gives more people an understanding of public processes and how they work, and it shows the public that we're willing to make an investment in the community when it comes to the designing of these solutions for our community. And the learnings live beyond the project. What we've learned in each co-design process can be applied to many future things that we do as a community. Feedback that we got from our sustainability and resiliency plan is applicable to many other plans or programs that we might use. And so making sure that we're keeping track of that data and those experiences that are collected and using those for future processes before we're going back out and asking people to engage with us again on something new. So ultimately what this does is it makes more inclusive and equitable projects, plans, and programs that are reflective of our community, because we're designing it with the community, not for the community. And so with that, I will just open it up if there are any questions for us. I know Sadie dropped some of our co-design links in the chat. I'll put the USDN, the Urban Sustainability Directors Network, has a Resilience Hubs website, which is really great and has a lot of plans and guides and videos of other communities' examples. So we can put that link in the chat as well, but happy to answer any questions about co-design, the surface water management plan, this grant itself, or how any of that fits together. And thank you all.
Thank you so much. That was
fantastic
a lot of
presentation.
information and great.
Yeah.
Questions from anyone here?
One thing that
So,
I
a question I
am
have here-
curious.
Go ahead.
Oh, one thing that I'm curious
Oh.
for the members of this group to think about is, we heard about the community co-design process, and I feel like there's projects that this group works on or is aware of on your teams that this process might be a future good fit for. So if you've got ideas, I'd like to see those in the chat, and just something as you're thinking of questions to think about as well.
Great idea. Thanks.
This
Sean,
is,
it looks like you have a question.
Yeah, we have a couple of projects that we're using this kind of model with here in Minneapolis. One of them is here at Hiawatha Lake, looking at how to remove barriers for low-income and BIPOC people to use the shared mobility, scooters, bikes, and EV car sharing. So that's, we having a kind of community design neighbors on that. Another one is with the Minneapolis Resilience Hubs, how to work with the surrounding neighborhood groups to be able to create, bonding between the neighborhoods and the Resilience Hub, and how to strengthen connections between neighbors, which is kind of the basis of resilience. And I'm curious, in Rochester, I know you kind of have some neighborhood groups, but are there other ways that you're trying to build connections between people in apartment buildings or on different blocks, so people can watch out for their neighbors if they have health issues, or like these bad air days, super hot days, if there's any other type of more bottom-up neighbor resilience things that Rochester is looking into?
I would say that's kind of what this is starting to get us into. We have our neighbors, which is a group, and they have a staff member that oversees all of the neighborhood associations within Rochester, and they're active in various ways for different projects and things within their neighborhood groups. I think that's something that we really heard from our co-designers in this process, was developing this on a neighborhood level. It's something that our emergency management director is thinking about with the updates to our emergency management plans. What are the neighborhood level things that can be done? And I think, that's kind of the next steps, is creating some of those toolkits, or, if it's something in a box that a neighborhood could have and take, that would better prepare them and connect them on that neighborhood level. I think this is kind of the start of that. Some neighborhood groups are much more active and involved and engaged than others. I think what we now have is the information from this co-design process of what are the kind of programs, or events or things that we could put up together as the city. Our library does a lot too, and is really engaged with things like that for community groups.
Actually, very good.
Also,
Yeah.
I want to add to that, that one of the things that we heard, especially from a co-designer who is active in their community, their neighborhood association, is that, government, we work slowly on a lot of things, especially when it comes to coordinating between different entities, or approvals and grants and all that stuff, right? So they kind of told us also that with some of this stuff going forward, they don't necessarily want government and staff departments to be the sole lead on all of it. They do expect us, though, to help find ways to support them in leading some of those efforts. And so, Sean, I wonder, maybe in a different conversation, if you know more about the efforts in Minneapolis and whether the government is leading those social cohesion kind of opportunities, or whether they are supporting another organization that's doing that themselves. Chris.
Yeah, thanks, Sadie.
We
This
are
is
going to be meeting this Thursday night with all the Minneapolis neighborhood groups and Minneapolis sustainability staff on exploring the questions of how the city could maybe take 20% of some of their new federal grants and invest it in outreach, as well as community grants. Community groups can apply for federal funding, but we need to figure out how to maintain our neighborhood groups, because they used to have tremendous amount of funding from neighborhood revitalization program, and now they're down to $10,000 a year, and many of them are losing out their staff. So I'll put it in the chat box if anybody wants to join us Thursday night, this week at North Regional Library.
Thanks, Sean, for that. That's great information. Sadie, my question for one of you guys is, do you continue to pay your co-design links people to like a retainer stipend, or do you offer them stipends when you have an initiative? Because it sounds like these are great hubs to be, continually working, that they've created some, or I know, not created, but helped spark something within the community. And is there city money that's going in to retain these leaders that you've trained?
It depends on the project. So we do have, they're paid throughout the co-design process for the one project they participate in. We have had some projects that choose to keep a couple of co-designers on. So our Discovery Walk project, that linear parkway, they actually paid for a couple of co-designers to continue to work with the architects on the design and iterations of that public realm project. So some are kept on. I think again, where we're moving to now is we've started these facilitator trainings to train these community members who have maybe participated in a couple of co-design processes to learn how to facilitate the process themselves, so that they can now be paid and compensated to be facilitators of future co-design processes. So I think that's kind of the way we're doing that.
So you're sort of creating a trained volunteer corps that can step forward when there's a project and get a stipend, but otherwise they're trained to be leaders within their own communities around these issues. And then there are opportunities when they want to interface with the government system to get a stipend for doing that work. Is that kind of an accurate assessment of it?
Yeah. Yep.
That's good. Thank you. A good understanding to have. Thank you.
Something that I noticed that was really cool is a lot of the co-designers, after they've gone through that process, they are taking leadership jobs in the community. So it is like a resume boost even too, and it wasn't intended necessarily that was going to be an outcome. I don't know that it was built for that, but it's really cool that some of our co-designers become leaders in different community organizations.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's building capacity again, and that some examples, one of our co-designers who participated in that Discovery Walk, which was our very first one, is now our city's DEI director. We had another co-designer who participated in Discovery Walk and our Bloomberg one, and she is now Destination Medical Center's Equitable Development Coordinator. So they're participating in these processes, they're getting experience and kind of how this works, this program management and development within cities and these organizations, and then building those connections with staff in these places as well, that then sets them up for these other opportunities within the community. Did you have a follow-up question?
I do. Stephanie, you asked for something in the chat, but I'm just going to say it right up here. I see a lot of parallels in this concept with our baseline underlying concept of Minnesota water stewards, and a lot of ways to maybe have a conversation out of the side of this meeting about greater Minnesota and applications of this model via our freshwater basis. Anyway, I see a lot of parallels, and I look for a follow-up meeting. I think it could be really exciting.
Yeah, one of the things that I was thinking about, and I don't think the co-design process would necessarily be a best fit, but it would be interesting to take inspiration from co-design to not that I'm in Rochester anymore, but for the City of Rochester's Adopt a Drain program, to looking at reaching different community groups and populations that we don't currently have participating, and work with them to figure out how to tweak the program. So that's why it's a little bit not necessarily aligned with co-design, because the program already exists. It's not creating or prototyping a program from scratch. But I'm not there anymore, so I will leave it to others to take that forward if interested.
Nick, did you have a question?
Oh yeah, thanks. I had several because it was a great presentation. The one that really caught me is that when you landed on some education outreach needs as like these results of like, here's what people really want to learn about. Um, is there a gap between what your staff and the job descriptions are kind of lining up and what people really want to learn about? And the example I think of is my job description is so focused on watershed improvement, and we've got our yard care and adopt the drain and these things that are, you know, on the periphery of these core sustenance kind of resilient themes. So is there a gap there? And are you needing to like bring in more expertise to actually back up the education that they want?
I would say yes. Being very honest, I am one sustainability coordinator for an entire city. And so it is really finding those partnerships either within departments or community groups. And capacity is very much an issue for a lot of departments right now. So I think it's going to be developing that probably, you know, in coordination between our emergency management team, probably bringing in our public library. They do a lot of that kind of work within the community as well. And then using existing resources or that we're aware of or have access to online that kind of maybe we don't have to totally reinvent the wheel, but there's things we could bring in and offer as educational resources through the library, or we also have an adult we have community education that offers adult enrichment classes. I teach a couple of classes now on just living sustainably in Rochester and then one on IRA incentives. But we have a variety of teachers that there's a whole sustainability category. So there's existing avenues I think we can work through. But it will be, you know, finding the time and capacity of where and when this fits into our work planning and who can come together to help develop it. And that is something we were honest with our co-designers about and really explaining that this is the first step of resilience hubs for Rochester, and it is going to require seeking out additional grants and funding opportunities to bring some of this to life. And so we were honest that like this is, you know, creating this final, you know, executive summary and outline of what we discussed through this co-design process will better set us up for those funding and grant opportunities. But that is just, it is going to take some time to put all of that together.
That's one of those areas, a specific example that our co-designer, who is already fairly active in, you know, community activism, I guess, had said they know that there's a ton of these grants coming out and they themselves don't have that expertise to do the filtering and analysis to know what applies where, you know, super quickly, like Lauren and Stephanie can. And so that's something that they expect of their government to be able to help support, is in identifying those, reaching out to them, and then supporting them, especially in opportunities where they are the primary applicant in it, and then helping support that, whether it be through the grant writing or you know, implementation, anything, those kinds of things. That is something that they expect of us in a way that we can support as city staff members in the creation.
Thank you very much. I'm watching the time and seeing we are about at the end. Were there any last questions real quick? And maybe do one more if there's one burning question.
One of the questions I had for Lauren is basically, because you're doing so great at coordinating between different departments at the city, does it make it easier for Rochester to feel comfortable taking in different new pots of money to get the work done? The challenge with a lot of smaller cities is they are going to kind of blow off into the new federal funding opportunities on things like water, trees, energy, because they don't have staff capacity. But it's like, how are you generating more staff capacity with different departments so they don't shy away from all this new funding pots coming down the pike.
That really has been a big piece of my role, is just making sure that departments know about the opportunities that are there and then assisting them if needed on those grant applications. We are fortunate that we do have a consultant on retainer to assist with some of these grant applications. And so it's really just kind of fine tuning and providing them the language and resources they need to put it together. But that has been my role with the city, is building this capacity through departments so that we're getting closer to the point that I don't have to sit on every project team meeting or be a part of every process, because we're providing those resources and kind of training our departments in a sense on what it looks like to incorporate sustainability and whatnot through their things. We still do have only so much capacity. We can't apply for every grant out there. And so it still is a prioritization of what's going to make the most impact for us right now. And we've done analyses on where we should put our efforts in terms of greenhouse gas emissions reductions. And so we do have priorities that Resilience Hubs isn't quite as high up on the list at the moment.
Thank you again very much to Lauren and Sadie, and to Stephanie as well for being here and pulling this all together. There's a bunch of links and emails in the chat. I will pull those together too when I post the recording of this and put it out on the Mobilize listserv for everybody. Hope everyone has a great rest of their day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all. This was great. Really appreciated it.
Thanks for
Thanks,
having
Ann.
us.